I'm Naomi Novik. Nice to meet you all. One of the things that I really like about the theme of this year's seminar is that I really love context. I love talking about influences, and I love making context explicit. And I really like context and conversation, both as a speaker and as an artist, and I'm going to talk about that a little more in a minute. So I want you to know my plan is roughly to give you a little bit of context about me, and some context including my recent work. I'm going to read a ruthlessly stripped down section of my current manuscript. And then I really want to ask you all for direction. I want you, if you have questions or if you just want to say, you know, that thing that you mentioned, talk more about that. Please do that. Please sort of help me guide the conversation between us, because otherwise I'll stand up here and read poetry. Yes. So a little bit of context. This came up a little bit in the panel yesterday. I started writing in college systematically, not seriously, but systematically as a fan fiction writer. I know there are many people who don't know what that means. For those who weren't here for the multiple definitions yesterday, the very simple shorthand would be if I went to the theater and saw, for instance, Aquaman, because of Jason Momoa in a tight costume. And I wrote a story about that, and I posted it on the internet. That would be a piece of fan fiction. And this is being done by millions of people on the internet today. It has been done for a long time before that. I think probably the earliest group that we would recognize as creators of fan fiction are the Sherlockians. The people who started writing stories about Sherlock Holmes, particularly after Arthur Conan Doyle killed him off the first time. For which they were very angry at him. And so the first thing that I wrote, the first time I started writing in 1994, and the first thing that I ever wrote and tried to get commercially published was my first novel, His Majesty's Dragon, the first book in the Temeraire series, and I started writing that in 2004. Before then, all of my work, all my crafting of stories, was done purely without any commercial motivation for pleasure. For my own pleasure, for the pleasure of my immediate group of friends, and for the pleasure of the larger fanish community in which we were working. And even now, I really try as a writer, very systematically, to always make sure that that's my number one priority. And when I say pleasure, I don't mean that in a sort of trivial or dismissive way. To me, the pleasure that we get from art is absolutely fundamental. It is fundamental to my own life. It has shaped my own life. And I could call it joy instead of pleasure. But I like using the word pleasure precisely because it evokes a certain sense of embarrassment. It evokes sensual pleasure. It evokes sort of guilty pleasure, and that is often the way that people have reacted to things like fan works, but also to other genres that are also, I think, defined by the desire to give pleasure, science fiction and fantasy, romance. A lot of artistic work that gets treated as low gets treated so because it's about making you feel good instead of bad. And I'm quite suspicious of that as an artist. I feel like art makes me feel good, and I want it to make other people feel good. That does not necessarily mean it shouldn't also make you think, or hurt, or cry. But I really value work trying to give pleasure. When I find an author who I feel like wants me to have a good time in all the many ways that you can have a good time, it makes me trust them. It makes me believe that they're not going to, try and shock me with some surprise that I'm not going to enjoy. And so one of the reasons that I value context so much is because context facilitates giving pleasure. I want to talk about, I was sort of thinking, how can I illustrate that really quickly? And I thought I would tell you a story. So here's the story. Once upon a time, there was a 16-year-old girl. Do you care about her yet in my story? Probably not, right? That's about as generic as it gets. You have no context for her whatsoever. Now, let me try and give you a little context for her. Her mother just recently passed away. That's, again, instant empathy, right? That gives you something to work with, but it's still not a lot. Her father recently remarried, all right? Her name is Ella, right? I have just instantly given you all a piece of context, right? Okay. Now, what I have done is, first of all, I've given you Cinderella. I've given you all the versions of that story that you have heard. I have given you the pleasure of anticipation. Yeah, you think you know where the story is going, right? You think you know what the story is going to be. And it's possible that what I might be about to do is just tell you the story, right? I might perform it in a really exciting way. If I was writing it down in a book, maybe I'm an illustrator and I paint beautiful pictures to go with it. Maybe I'm going to do something else interesting to it. Here, I'm going to tell you another piece of the story. Her stepmother had 2 daughters who bullied Cinderella in high school. Okay, now we're in the modern day. It's a modern day retelling of Cinderella. That's a little different. Now, it's starting to become, there are possibilities here. It can be the meal that you like very much. It can be the favorite meal that's prepared really well, has no surprises in it, but it's served to you nicely, and you have a great glass of wine, and it's a good time. Or it can be the meal that's a little different, spiced a little differently, turned around, deconstructed. Or I can tell you, for instance, that Cinderella's 2 stepsisters were recently killed in a car crash. And her stepmother and her father met because they were both grieving, and that's what formed their relationship. All of a sudden, the story is now completely different. And you have some of the pleasure of that emotional context. You know that there's some ways in which I'm connecting you to that original story, because I clearly deliberately named her Ella. I deliberately gave you pieces that evoke that original Cinderella story, but I'm going someplace completely different. So what that means is, with that context, I now have the power to give you the pleasures of recognition, the pleasures of the familiar. Plus, I can give you the pleasure of the transformed, something just slightly different. And I can give you the pleasure of surprise. And of course, you can do all that in a work that has no visible context. You can build context for people by giving them characters who feel familiar to them because they're people they know in their own lives, for instance, or they are archetypes that they're familiar with. You can build context slowly by just telling people about events that happen to characters. But having the context, having the power of an existing story made visible to the audience is a really powerful tool in an author's toolbox for giving pleasure. And so that's one of the reasons why fan fiction is so popular, because it lets you, as a storyteller, start out with a lot of context, with a lot of emotional investment. Nobody's going to go and read my Aquaman story on the internet unless they really like the movie and they want the story already. That's a huge benefit. I don't have to sell them on my Aquaman story. They want to read it. And that means that it's, first of all, they are coming to the story with so much of the work done. As a writer, it's very tempting to think that you're doing the work, but the reader does at least half the work when they come to a story. And that's why there is no work so great that it doesn't have a 1-star review on Amazon. There is no work so terrible that it doesn't have a 5-star review, even if it's just by the person's mom. Because that mom has a lot of context for that story, And So, for instance, Spinning Silver, my most recent novel, is a story that grew out of Rumpelstiltskin. It's not a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. It doesn't follow the plot of Rumpelstiltskin. It doesn't have the characters of Rumpelstiltskin. No one ever spins straw into gold. But Miriam, who's one of the heroines, one of the 6 narrators, is herself simultaneously at times Rumpelstiltskin and the miller's daughter. And she is also living with the anti-Semitism that underlies the original story. And that is how I learned to tell a story as a fanfic writer, to sort of pick out the pieces of an existing story that I cared about, to build them into a vehicle and put myself inside it and go someplace new. And that's the kind of storytelling that I enjoy, that I want to do. And when I'm doing it, I want you to have as much context as I can give you, because I think that adds to the pleasure. You don't have to know Rumpelstiltskin to read and understand Spinning Silver, but I think the context makes it more interesting. I think you get that pleasure of recognition of the elements of the other fairy tales that come in there. Many people have personal experiences in their lives that make the book resonate with them. People whose parents, like mine, grew up in Eastern Europe will often tell me, that they recognized elements of their own family experience in the story. And I feel like giving you as much context as I can, making it as visible as I can, is a way for me to let you connect it to the stories that are already inside your head. And that's what I want to do. I want to get inside the reader's head. I want to give them that pleasure, that connection. And in addition, I also think it's quite bad the way that, there's a fairly recent fad for the sense of originality, for the importance of originality, that often leads people to try and obfuscate their influences, to try and hide their context, to try and get away from their context, to feel that their work isn't valuable unless they can get as far away as possible from the thing that they're trying to speak to. And I think that's very, very bad for art, because it's lying. And I think that the most important thing we have to do as artists, is to try and tell the truth in a fundamental way, which means not try and dig something out of ourselves that we really believe that is really true in our experience and put it on the page. And if you're not doing that, if you're sort of getting in your own way, which is really easy to do, then you're sort of making it harder for yourself to tell that story. So now I'm going to read a chunk of the thing I've been working on, and to give you the context for this, it came out of a Harry Potter phase in my fanish life, which, because I'm contrary, came in 2016, so roughly a decade after everyone else's Harry Potter phase. And it also comes out of a theme that I started to work on in Spinning Silver, which is my understanding of what real magic is and what it means to make magic in the world, and how we make it and its cost. And it also comes out of a legend that I read about a school of magic called the Scholomance. And I read this in a half-page sidebar in a Time Life Mysteries of the Occult book. I don't know if any of you ever saw the ads for that on TV in the 80s. And I found a copy of it in my middle school library when I was around 11 or so. And it was literally, this much information about this school, which was a school run by the devil, and 11 sorcerers came in, and 10 got to leave, and the devil kept the soul of the 11th to pay for their schooling. And that is one of those stories that, for no obvious reason, has stuck with me. And it has turned up in my fan fiction, and now it's coming out in this story, which is currently working title is in fact Scholomance. So I'm going to read this and then move to questions. Start with water. I decided Orion really needed to die after the second time he saved my life. Selfish of me, you'll say, to long for the death of the hero responsible for the continued survival of a quarter of our class. Well, too bad for the losers who couldn't stay afloat without his help. We're not meant to all survive. The school has to be fed somehow. What about me then, you ask, since I needed him to save me, twice even? Well, and that's exactly why he had to go. No one was going to let me explain that he had collapsed the laboratory on my head in the first place, fighting that chimera, or that he chased the Soul Eater into my cell. You could get away with one explanation like that, at best, and after that, no one cared. So I had just fallen into the general mass of the hapless warts that Orion Lake had saved in the course of his brilliant progress, and that was intolerable. He was standing more or less heroically, over the bubbling purplish smear of the Soul Eater on the floor, incandescence still shining from his hands and illuminating his sweaty face. "You okay, gal, right?" he said to me tiredly, just to put some salt on the wound. We'd been on the same hall for 2 years. "No thanks to you and your boundless fascination for every dark thing creeping through the place," I said. "And it is not gal, it has never been gal, it's Galadriel. The name wasn't my idea, don't look at me. And if that's too many syllables for you to manage all in one go, L will do." His head had jerked up and he was blinking at me in a sort of open-mouthed way. "Oh, I'm sorry?" he said, voice rising on the words as if he didn't understand what was going on. No, I said. "I'm sorry. Clearly, I'm not performing my role up to standard." I threw a melodramatic hand up against my forehead. "Orion, I was so terrified." I flung myself onto him. He tottered a bit. I was taller than him. "Thank goodness you were here to save me. I could never have managed a Soul Eater all on my own." And I hiccuped a pathetically fake sob against his shoulder. He actually tried to put his arm around me and give me a pat. That's how automatic it was for him. Well, I stepped on his foot and jammed my elbow into his stomach and shoved him off. He made a choked noise like a woofing dog and staggered back. "I don't need your help, you insufferable lurker," I said. "Keep away from me or you'll be sorry." I slammed the cell door, with the big hole where the doorknob had used to be, for which thanks, Orion, and to his face, enjoying the look of perfect confusion as it vanished away. However, the Soul Eater was still bubbling away on the floor of my cell, hissing as it deflated the rest of the way, a putrescent stink filling the room. I was so angry that it took me 6 tries to get a spell for cleaning it up. When I stood up and hurled the 4th ancient scroll back into the impenetrable dark on the other side of my desk and yelled furiously, "I don't want to summon an army of Skuvara. I don't want to conjure walls of mortal flame. I want my bloody room clean." What came flying out of it in return was a horrible tome encased in some kind of pale, crackly leather. It had probably come off a pig, but someone wanted you to think it had been flayed from a person, which was almost as bad. And it landed on my page and landed on my desk and flipped open to a page with instructions for enslaving an entire mob of people to do your bidding and clean things for you. I had to actually take out one of my mother's crystals and sit down on my bed and meditate for 10 minutes, with the stench of the Soul Eater wafting all around me and getting into my hair and clothes and sheets. Then I pushed the pigskin book off the far edge of my desk back into the dark. I used a pen just in case, and said as calmly as I could manage, "I want a simple household spell for cleaning away an unwanted mess with a bad odor." Sullenly down came thump, a gigantic volume entitled Amunan Hamwarod, packed completely full of spells written in Old English, my weakest dead language, and it didn't open to any particular page either. Did anyone even make books back when they spoke Old English? I was reasonably sure it was just to spite me. That sort of thing is always happening to me. Some sorcerers get an affinity for weather magic, or animal transformation, or fantastic combat spells like Dear Orion. I got an affinity for mass destruction. It's my mother's fault, of course, just like my stupid name. She's one of those flowers and beads and crystal sorts, dancing to the goddess under the moon. Everyone's a lovely person, and anyone who does anything wrong is misunderstood or unhappy. She does massage for mundanes because it's so relaxing to make people feel better, love. And she barely even takes money for it. And she only does that because if you offer to do professional massage without charging, people look at you sidelong. As well they should. She's never used a drop of Malia in her life, not even when she was in here herself. So naturally, I came out the exact opposite way, as anyone with a basic understanding of the balancing principle might have expected. Not that I can actually use any of these charming spells the school is so eager to hand out to me. Funny enough, you can't actually whip up an entire army of demons on a wink. It takes Malia, and lots of it. Everyone, well, nearly everyone, uses a bit of Malia here and there, stuff they don't even think of as wicked. Magic a slice of bread into cake without gathering the mana for it first, that sort of thing, which everyone thinks is just harmless cheating. Well, the power's still got to come from somewhere, and if you aren't gathering it yourself, then it's probably coming from something alive, because it's easy to get energy out of something that's already moving around. So you get your slice of cake, and meanwhile, a colony of ants in your backyard stiffen and die and disintegrate. Of course, you can make yourself an entire 3-layer cake every day of your life and still live to 150 and die peacefully in your bed, assuming you don't die of cholesterol poisoning first. But if you start using Malia on a grander scale than that, for instance, trying to raise a city or slaughter an army at once, or any of the 1,000 other useless things that I know how to do, you can't get enough of it, except by sucking in life force from things complicated enough to have feelings and resist you. And then you're getting psychically clawed while you pull the power. Of course, I'm good at stealing life force too, or I would be if I was stupid or desperate enough to try it. I have to give Mum credit there. She did all that attachment parenting nonsense, which in my case meant her lovely, sparkling clean aura enveloped mine enough to keep me from getting into Malia early. When I brought home small frogs in order to mess with their intestines, it was all supremely gentle. No, love, we don't hurt living creatures. And she would give me ice cream to make up for taking them away. Well, I was 5. Ice cream was my only motivation for wanting power. So as you can imagine, I brought all my little finds to her. By the time I was old enough that she couldn't have stopped me, I was old enough to understand what happens to sorcerers who use Malia. Darling Jack Westrother down the hall is going to start rotting on the inside within the first 5 years after he graduates, since he's already started stealing life force from other students. In 10 years, he'll cave in on himself in a nice grotesque rush. Then they'll dig up his basement and find 100 corpses, and everyone will tut and say, my, he seemed like such a nice young man. So, no Malia for me. But I don't have family, not aside from my mum, and I don't have an enclave to live in either. We live in the Radiant Mind commune near Cardigan in Wales, which also boasts a shaman, 2 spirit healers, a Wiccan circle, and a troupe of Morris dancers, all of whom have roughly the same amount of real power, which is to say, none whatsoever, and all of whom would fall over in horror if they saw Mum or me doing real magic. Well, me. Mum does magic by dancing up mana with a group of willing volunteers. I've told her she ought to charge people, but no. And then she spreads it out again freely in sparkles and happiness, tra-la. People let us eat at their tables because they love her, who wouldn't, and they built her a yurt when she came to them fresh out of school and 3 months pregnant with me. But none of them can help me do magic or defend me against Maleficaria. Even if they could, they wouldn't. They don't like me. No one does except Mum. You wouldn't believe the number of supposedly nice people who've said to me brightly how excited I must be to graduate school. They have no idea. And strike out on my own, get my own place, see more of the world far away from them. Not that I want to stay on the commune. I don't know if you can properly appreciate just how horrible it is to be constantly surrounded by people who believe in absolutely everything, from leprechauns to sweat lodges to Christmas carols, and who won't believe that you can do actual magic. I've literally shown people or tried to, and they all say, wow, and how amazing. And the next day it's all, man, those drugs were really good. And then they avoid me even more. My only chance for a decent life is to get invited into an enclave where the other wizards will support me in exchange for having me in reserve against some massive threat. But no one's going to be inviting me anywhere if they think I'm actually some sort of pathetic damsel in distress. They certainly won't do it because they like me. Meanwhile, Orion doesn't need to impress anybody at all. His mother is one of the top candidates to be the next domina of the Manhattan Enclave, and his father is a master artificer. He could just look out for himself, do the bare minimum of coursework, and walk out to spend the rest of his life in luxury and safety, surrounded by the finest wizards and the most wonderful artifice in the world. Instead, he's spending his school years making a massive spectacle of himself, saving every weakling and dullard who crosses his path, and never mind who's going to pay for that. The Scholomance isn't a gift. Oh yes, do sign me up for 4 years living in a shoebox cell, where at any moment some hideous thing might come lurching through the door to devour me. The Enclaves only built the school because outside is worse. The Maleficaria don't come from the Scholomance, they come to the Scholomance, because we're all in here, and adolescent wizards are the tastiest snacks there are. If we were out there, they'd pounce on us one by one. Here, because the only opening is down below, they spend loads of time fighting each other to get at us, and we can band together to hold them off. Not one wizard child in 50 makes it through puberty outside. 1 in 4 is decent odds compared to that. But of course we have to pay. We pay with our work, and we pay with our misery and our terror, and we pay, most of all, with the ones who don't make it. So what good exactly does Orion think he's doing? What good does anyone think he's doing, saving people? The price tag will still come due eventually. That's the end. All right, so I feel like, obviously I think that's part of why this is titled The High Cost of Magic, because one of the things that inspired it, one of the things that I'm thinking about is how in Harry Potter, magic is free, right? It's not proportionate to the amount of work that you have to do, and it's not entirely consistent. The economy of magic doesn't work there. So for instance, why isn't everybody making themselves a potion of Felix Felicitas and giving themselves the best luck every single day? How is it that Hermione essentially is like magicking up an entire living room in a tent so they can go glamping while they're trying to hunt Horcruxes? And while I love Harry Potter, that's what being a crazed fan who writes fan fiction is all about. But at the same time, it's those kinds of thoughts, those kinds of questions that make me want to write something more, something further afield, that make me want to keep going in another direction. And that's a lot of why I think it's important to know the context and know where it's coming from so that you can follow along on more of the journey. All right, so let me start questions. Does anyone want to start? I can't.
Hi, I have a question in the balcony. I was first exposed to spinning silver through an anthology, The Starlit Wood. And when you're talking about a community of writers, I feel like the speculative fiction anthologies often allow writers to have conversations with each other in a shorter time span than novels. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yes, it's one of the things that I loved about The Starlit Wood was, in fact, it evoked for me very much the kinds of challenges that happen routinely in the fan fiction community. Very frequently, very famously, there was something called the Egg Beater Challenge, where I think this happened in X-Files fandom, where everyone was challenged to write a story that somehow had an egg beater in it. And that kind of challenge, that kind of, take this one element that I am giving to you and play, is something that I love because I think that it provides a spark. And so what they did with the Starlit Wood anthology, was the editors put together a list of fairy tales and they asked all of us as authors to choose one so that each story would have a different route. And so I procrastinated on it. And basically, people, as I am wont to do, and so they kept asking me, which story are you taking? I'm like, I'm not sure yet. And the list kept getting shorter and shorter and shorter, until it was quite short. And then, they're like, all right, you really have to choose a story at this point. The stories are due in a month. And so then I finally looked at that shortened list, and Rumpelstiltskin leapt out at me because it evoked for me initially a story that I knew from my family, that my grandmother had once been arrested for smuggling gold for dollars behind the Iron Curtain. And that sort of one element connected to the anti-Semitism of Rumpelstiltskin, and the sort of the visuals of the gold in that story, and it sort of provided the point where I met the canon, where I met the source. And I think that's a lot of what happened in many of the stories in that anthology. And what unfortunately doesn't happen in an anthology like that, which does happen in the fan fiction communities, is that we all wrote our stories in isolation, separate, and they were published together. So they do. I do think that the anthology itself creates its own context as well for the audience, because you go into the anthology knowing that there's going to be an element of some fairy tale that you probably know something about in there. And that makes it feel like, one of those treasuries of fairy tales that we all grew up reading, the Blue Fairy book or the Disney storybook or whatever, that sort of box of treasure. And I felt like the Starlit Wood had that quality as a result. But one of the things that I also love is when stories are written almost in response to each other, which happens a lot, where you see the story somebody else wrote and you're like, oh, I'm going to write a story with an egg beater, but it's going to be inspired by your story with the egg beater, and I'm going to use the egg beater in a totally different way. And that's another thing that happens in fan fiction routinely, because nobody can tell anyone, well, you can't write a story inspired by or reacting to my fan fiction story, right? Because you're writing it in response or reaction to something else. And so I think it encourages people to feel that they're contributing to a larger body of work, and building a sort of communal body of work that then becomes a source for other people. Any other? See?
Hi. So between today and yesterday, we've heard a lot about some of the positive influence being in the fan community has had on your work. I'm wondering if there's any dark side of the fan fiction community that you'd want to speak toward.
Dark side. I think the dark side is the same as the positive side, which is that, and I touched on this earlier, right? So the word fan, it comes from fanatic. And, the idea of the guilty pleasure, it's the pleasure that you are not rewarded for indulging. It is the pleasure that is just for you. And it is a pleasure that really only comes because it's deeply motivated internally, right? Nobody pays the vast majority of fan fiction writers to go and write their story and post it on the internet. They're only doing that out of love for the material, out of intense love, out of that need that, I think literally everyone has written fan fiction in the sense of, in their own head, thinking, well, what if that story went a different way? Or I wonder what's going to happen on next week's episode. I bet that this thing is going to happen. That kind of storytelling is so integral to us as people. It's just what we do. We imagine what might come next. But to actually go to the trouble of like crafting a story that is comprehensible to other people, that has more or less a narrative structure, and formatting it, putting it on the internet, sharing it, making the effort to share it with other people, comes from a place of intensity. It comes from a place of excess, too much love. And so because you love the thing so much, right, that same passion that will, sorry, I'm going to have to drink some water. The same kind of passion that makes you go to that effort is the same kind of passion that can make it quite wounding to people to read a story that does not respect their idea of the characters. For instance, if you think that character would never do, if you're somebody who identifies, for instance, with Hermione Granger, as so many young women do, and you read a story where Hermione does something that you're like, she would never do that. If you're so passionately identified with her, that can actually be hurtful. Or if it's a story in which she's killed. In fact, when we built the Archive of Our Own, which is a nonprofit archive that I helped create in order to host fan fiction and archive it, one of the main warnings that we had to put, that we require people to warn for, or either say that they're not warning for anything, is a major character death. Because people find it so intensely upsetting when a character that they love dies in a story, even if there are 10,000 stories about that same character on the same archive, and it's literally one click away to read a different story. And so because of that, you can often get excessive, disproportionate, sometimes violent reactions to fiction. And because people are all in such a close community, sometimes you get really kind of hostile responses. People do over-the-top things, trolling people. The kind of behavior that you see in political arguments can often happen, and it's over like a story where Harry actually marries Ginny the way he does in the original book. And that's the level, that same passion. So that passion has a dark side. And it's a side that can hurt. And for myself, I have never found it outweighing the benefits that I get. I do know people who have found that, who have found the intensity that can happen in the community just hits them too hard on a personal level. But for me, that's the natural consequence of the passion in it, if that makes sense. So the question is there any physical space where fans meet? Yes, absolutely. There are fan conventions, just like there are literary seminars. There are probably most of you have heard of San Diego Comic-Con or New York Comic-Con, which are huge. But those are fairly recent, and they're very commercial. There's a proud tradition of tiny little, 1,000-people science fiction conventions. There's a whole network of them that happen on a regular basis. Many of them are 30, 40 years old and have been happening continuously on an annual basis. There are communities specifically for fan activity that have been created. So there are places where people will meet in person. But as is so often true about people who meet in person, once you're actually meeting in person, it suddenly doesn't matter anymore that you had an argument about Hermione Granger on the internet. And that's, in fact, one of the things that I, speaking, another aspect of context, right, is so often now on the internet, we participate in conversations where the context of our lives, the context of who we are as a whole, does not appear. And we see the problems with that. You know, when you're having an argument on Twitter with people who don't know who you are, your words get misunderstood. Obviously, the word limit makes it quite hard to say anything complicated. And if you try, the lack of context makes it extremely easy for people to read it in the context of their own experience, which may be completely, different from yours. There's the practice of subtweeting, right? Where people will tweet something that they are referring obliquely to some other, post that they've seen somewhere, but they're not making it explicit what they're referring to. And so unless you happen to be in the conversation or know what it is that they're talking about, you read it and you're like, I don't understand this at all. And sometimes it's actively offensive in ways that it wouldn't be if you knew the context. And so I think that's a broader example of how context affects our conversation and our understanding of just any kind of communication, not just art. Yes, there's
Time
some
for
more.
one more kind of quick response.
Oh, yeah.
The process of doing fan fiction is a very community-oriented, and then you're writing novels, which, and I've heard author after author say it's such a lonely process. What is the contrast for you, and how do you get that feedback that you're used to getting?
It's not a lonely process for me because when I write my novels, I am having them beta read by the same people who read my fan fiction. The same people that I developed a community connection with. When I started writing Temeraire, I was posting it on my LiveJournal in locked posts and saying, hey, you like my fanfic stories. Is this good? Does this feel original enough? Is this interesting? And, many people came out of the woodwork. Professional writers in my community that I didn't know were professional writers were giving me advice, and also professional readers, were telling me, yes, I want to know more about this story. And I've really tried to keep that community. And in fact, I would say that the loneliness is not actually a difference between fan fiction or commercial writing for me now. It's purely that I have so much less time since I've had a child. So now I'm like in a chat room with like 10 other people instead of posting broadly to 100 people. So I don't have the time to maintain the conversation and the network, and do the beta reading of my own that I would do for other people, and that community, I can't overstate the importance of having and finding that community. We all know things like, the Bloomsbury Group, right? That the ways in which writers operating in a community can support one another and feed one another, and I feel like that's something that I tremendously still get and that I'm always seeking. And I mean, I'm frequently writing literally like lines at a time. Which of these 2 lines do you like better? Because I'm hanging out in a chat room with them. And one of them's in England, and actually the other one is my best friend who's often actually in the same room with me, but we're still talking in a chat room because that's how we are. So basically I just, community and context. All right, thank you all so much.